I'm at the point that every beginner painter gets to where they're clearly being held back by the tools that they're using. These manual brushes just aren't cutting it anymore. And so I recently acquired an airbrush and have instantly become a better and faster painter. No longer will I be forced to paint with these archaic and outdated methods favoured by artisans hundreds and thousands of years ago. This airbrush is going to accelerate my painting journey into the 21st century. My first experience and introduction to airbrushes was probably very similar to a lot of other people's experience. It goes a little something like, I want to look up a tutorial on YouTube. Step 1. Get your airbrush. Ironically, since I've now got an airbrush, I can't find any tutorials on some of the specific things I want to do with it. Joking aside from that intro, I wasn't really looking to get an airbrush. I felt like I had a lot more to learn with my regular brushes and a lot more I could do with my pile of shame before diving into getting an airbrush. However, being in my 30s and having disposable income to buy whatever I want, including far too much Warhammer, I was once again given that dreaded yearly question from my family. What do you want for Christmas? Normally my answer is nothing. If I want something, I'll go buy it. I don't want to have to either A, wait, or B, have someone else buy something for me. I especially don't want people to spend money on me if they're people who have already invested large amounts of money into what is frankly a terrible return on investment. I mean, what would you rather choose? £200,000 for a bunch of up-and-coming tech stocks in the 90s? Or me? Fortunately, my parents make terrible decisions, so this year I decided just to ask them for an airbrush and a compressor to go with it. As with all new things like this, the very first task is of course to immediately get anxiety about it, thinking of all the possible ways I could potentially break it, ruin all my models, break my house down, all sorts of nightmare, everything's on fire, rocks fall, everyone dies.
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria!
After that standard ritual, it was time to actually get to work and use this thing. Much like getting a new puppy for Christmas, an airbrush is for life. It needs proper care and attention and loads of accessories to make sure it's fully healthy mentally and physically. So I procured all the necessary extra things you need and did a load of research on the best maintenance and training methods. After all of that research and just staring at the airbrush to make sure I knew exactly what it looked like, the next step was to really understand this thing inside out, just in case of any sort of critical issues and just to really fully understand every component. I just wanted to make sure that I knew what I was doing if anything ever happened, like there was a blockage or any other issues. Now, with all of that preparation out of the way, it was finally time to paint something. I chose to work on the Screaming Raven's Ballistus Dreadnought first. My understanding is that for beginners, airbrushes are very, very good at this kind of thing, larger models with a lot of flat panels. I chose the Ballistus specifically over some of my other bigger models because I had an okay idea for it, and I'm not as precious with it as some of my other ones. So even though I did undercoat this with black primer, the very first thing I did was go over it with the airbrush with black. This is fairly standard anyway. You want to go over with a color that you can then clean up with later, and generally the primer paints are not the same as some of the paints you'll have in the pot. And that first attempt with the airbrush went fine. It's black on black, so there's not really much you can see, but I didn't have any issues with the thinness of the paint or anything. It seemed to go on quite smooth, and I managed to get all the coverage I needed. Mostly this was also just to practice, the trigger, making sure I knew how much pressure to put on, how much I need to pull back, and a couple of other things. Something I still struggle with and need to drill into my head with the airbrush is making sure that when you want to stop, you make sure you stop the paint first before the air. If you stop the air first, some of the paint is still in the nozzle, so when you then do the next coat, it does a little bit of a splatter at the start. You can probably just do that onto the paper first or outside of the model, but there was a couple of times I forgot and had to try and clean that up. Next was to actually put some colour on this, and the colour I chose was red. In the Crusade I'm playing in, the Ballistus has done quite well. It's got enough experience to get an upgrade, but then it got a battle scar, and I decided to remove the upgrade to avoid the battle scar. Because of that, my idea is to have the vibe of a car where you've had to replace the door, but the door is a different colour. I like the thought of this Ballistus having its entire left side ripped apart by a Norn emissary, so they just found a random spare part from another dreadnought, just slapped it on the side. This is where things started to go wrong. When I tried to put the red on to start with, I was getting a lot of spiderwebbing, huge amounts of it. Fortunately, because the paint was still so wet, I was able to get most of it off with the kitchen towel. But I did this a few times over and over, and eventually it started to stain the model, so I had to go back over with black again to get it back to a good base color. Searching through a bunch of tutorials, it was quite difficult to understand what was going wrong. There were a couple of things, but the main problem I had was paint thinning. Now, paint thinning is a problem I have with airbrush or hairbrush. Doesn't matter either way, thinning your paints is a very, very difficult thing to get as a beginner, and you just need to get into the practice of trying to understand the feel. A lot of tutorials will say it's very difficult to give you exact quantities, because obviously each paint is different, thinners are different, even your environment is different. But whoever started the trend of telling people that you need to look for the consistency of skimmed milk needs to be fired out of a cannon into the sun. What are you talking about, consistency of skim milk? Who knows that? Can anyone out there, apart from maybe dairy farmers, actually tell the difference between a skimmed milk, semi-skimmed milk, whole milk? It makes no sense. Most other things that people use to try and describe it on videos, saying, oh, try and see if it runs down the cup, or just saying, oh, you're looking for a consistency like this, and just kind of showing you a little bit of paint. They're both fine, but they're very difficult to gauge, and I do understand that it's very, very hard to tell people over video. The folly I ran into was by using a brush, I was underestimating how much of the paint I was actually getting into the pot for the airbrush. That massive under-thinning of the paint was what was causing the spiderwebbing problem. Spiderwebbing is essentially caused by the air from the airbrush pushing out paint that's still wet and spreading it out. Normally, that aerosolized paint should dry pretty quickly as it hits the surface, much like a primer would. But if your paint is too thin, it's not going to dry quick enough, and then the air coming behind it will spread it out. This can also happen if the air pressure is too high. Even if you've got the right mix, if the air pressure is too high, it's going to hit it too hard, and that's also going to cause spiderwebbing. Frustratingly, it was one of those things where I kept testing on paper and it seemed to be fine, but as soon as it hit the model, it wasn't working right. It just spiderwebbed immediately. Sometimes I would be doing part of the model, it'd be absolutely fine, and then suddenly it starts spiderwebbing again. It is still better to err on the side of caution with thinned paints because you don't want to go too thick, because that's what causes a bunch of blockages. I did get 1 or 2 blockages during my painting session with the airbrush, but nothing major, fortunately. Eventually, after getting a few color changes, using a few techniques, I got a result I was fairly happy with. If you zoom in really close on some of these places, you can see some of that spiderwebbing, around the knee especially, but from a distance, you can't really see it anymore. And then, like with all models, as long as you put enough edge highlights, a bunch of basing materials, and then just scatter some brown and silver and call it weathering, you get a model that actually looks pretty nice. I enjoy the fact that there's no weathering on the red side, 1, to show off that airbrush so I can kind of see how it looks, and 2, to have that look of it's a new part they've had to put on, so it actually wouldn't have been weathered. The rest of the body would have been weathered during combat, but this is a new part. And it really fits nicely into the Screaming Raven theme of black, silver, and whatever. I still have a lot to learn about airbrushing, and it's probably not something I'm going to use that often. I've still got a lot to learn about regular brushing, and a lot of my backlog probably wouldn't need the airbrush. So I'm probably not going to use it as frequently or as efficiently as I could, but I will get around to using it more and more, especially as I get to some of my bigger models. At the very least, it was a lot of fun and got me back into that painting mood, which is something I've been struggling with for a little while, so I'm really happy to have got one. I don't think it's a necessary thing, and it would be nice if tutorials actually didn't just assume everyone had an airbrush, although I think those tutorials are more for things that are a bit more advanced, so you probably would have an airbrush by that point. And there's a lot more maintenance that goes with an airbrush, a lot of stuff you have to get for it, you have to make sure you're not going to die by inhaling a bunch of paint fumes, for example, inside your room. If you have any airbrushing tips or tricks or any airbrushing stories as a beginner, or any ideas for what I should use this thing for, then leave your comments below. I love to read them, and thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this, go and like and subscribe, all the YouTube stuff, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.